3 days after my son's funeral, my daughter-in-law changed the locks and moved her parents into the house I built. With my own 2 hands, I stood outside in the rain. Not a word of warning, just the kind of silence that tells you you were never really wanted. But I didn't cry. I turned away and began preparing for the day. I would return with something they never saw coming. The sky hadn't stopped weeping since the funeral. I remember thinking it was the kind of cold that settled in your bones, like sorrow that never fully leaves. I pulled into the driveway, gravel crunching under the tires like a warning. My hand reached automatically for the garage remote clipped to the visor, but nothing happened. No blinking red light, no familiar hum, just stillness. I got out of the car keys in hand, the ones I'd carried for almost 20 years. The front porch looked the same. The wind chimes still swayed by the door. The little iron dragonfly Russell had given me on my 65th birthday still hung from the beam. I stepped up, turned the key. It didn't fit. Not like stuck or jammed. It didn't belong. I stared at the door for a moment, confused more than anything. Then I noticed the envelope taped beside the door frame, flapping in the wind. My name was written in a rush, like someone wanted it over with. Inside a single sheet, typed. We've made adjustments to the household arrangements for everyone's emotional recovery. Please understand that this space is being restructured for balance and healing. That was it. No signature, no explanation, no Melissa. The door stayed shut. I stood there in the rain in the same black coat I'd worn at Russell's graveside 3 days before. My boots were sinking into the wet welcome mat. The only sound was the distant cry of a mourning dove and the steady drip from the gutter above me. I didn't knock, not once, because something inside me already knew. The door had been closed long before the key stopped working. I had just been too wrapped in grief to hear it slam. I got back in the car, turned on the heater, even though I couldn't feel the warmth. I didn't drive away right away. I sat there looking at that house. The one we built. The one Russell grew up in. The one I signed over when he said it would help with the refinancing. The curtains in the living room were different. Melissa's taste. Cold colours, grey and taupe, and nothing soft. As I backed out of the driveway, I caught a glimpse of movement through the side window. 2 silhouettes. Not Melissa. Her parents. She hadn't wasted time. That night I slept in the little cabin at the edge of the property, the one I used to store herbs and garden tools. No heat, but it had a roof. And right then, a roof over my head without the stench of betrayal was all I could stomach. If you've ever stood on a porch that used to be yours and felt like an intruder, then you'll understand what I mean when I say, it wasn't just a lock that changed that day. It was everything. The cabin was never meant to be lived in. It didn't even have insulation, just raw pine walls, a sagging cot, and shelves filled with mason jars of dried herbs. I used to come out here in the fall to sort lavender, basil, chamomile. Russell would tease me, call it my witch's hut. I always laughed at that. It felt safe out here. Now it was the only place left that was mine. I lit a candle. The power hadn't run to the cabin since we stopped using the generator 5 years ago. I hadn't needed it. The house had everything. Running water, heat, family. I pulled an extra quilt from the trunk I kept under the cot. The stitching was old, the fabric worn thin. Not beautiful, but familiar, like my life before Melissa moved in. Russell had asked me to split the land when he got engaged, said it would make things easier for taxes. I didn't blink. Of course I'd give him the lot with the house. He was my son, my only child. Back then it felt like passing something forward. A generational handoff. I kept the lot next to it, 2.5 acres, with the old tool shed and my herb garden. At the time, I just thought of it as keeping a little privacy for myself. somewhere to grow things in peace. But now that strip of land was the only reason I wasn't homeless. The next morning I woke to the sound of rakes. I peeked through the slit in the wood. Melissa's father was clearing leaves from the back porch. Her mother stood nearby with a clipboard. They were moving in like they belonged, like it had always been theirs. I made coffee over a small gas burner, the kind I used for canning in the summer. There was something bitter about the taste that morning. Not the coffee. The realization. No one came looking for me. Not a call. Not a knock. No one even asked where I had gone. Inside that house where I used to read stories to Russell as a boy, new voices were taking over. The sound of someone else's family replacing mine. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of my land. My boots sank into damp earth, but I kept going, tracing every inch of the boundary I had drawn on paper years ago. I found the old iron markers Russell and I had hammered into the soil. They were rusted, but still standing. This was still mine. I returned to the cabin and pulled out a folder from my storage chest. Inside were old land documents, notarized, recorded, still valid. I had forgotten how meticulous I'd been in those years. Maybe part of me had always known to hold something back. The sky turned a deeper grey as the sun dropped behind the tree line. I sat on the porch steps, wrapped in the old quilt, staring out at the place I used to call home. From here, it didn't look like mine anymore. But I still had soil under my nails. I still had a deed in my name. I still had breath in my lungs. And I wasn't finished yet. That morning I took out my old notebook, the green one with the worn spiral and bent cover. It wasn't for journaling or poems. It was where I kept lists, not shopping or birthdays. I wrote down what people did when they thought no one was watching. It started as habit when Russell was a boy and I was managing the school library. But over the years it became something else. A quiet place to record what I couldn't bring myself to say out loud. I flipped to the most recent page. The last entry had been a year ago, about the way Melissa had stopped knocking before entering my bedroom. That had been the start of small erasures. First came the casual suggestion that my herb jars cluttered the pantry. Then it was the bookshelves in the living room. One day I came home to find them gone, replaced by abstract prints in metal frames. She said it looked more modern. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. They were just objects. But objects carry stories. And slowly every story of mine was being pushed into silence. I turned the page and added a new line. Melissa's father clearing out Russell's closet. Melissa's mother measuring the kitchen window. Curtains changed to navy grey. All of Russell's books boxed and stacked in the garage. It had only been 4 days since the funeral. I kept writing. The list grew fast. No one had told me what was happening. I had not been asked. I had been edited out like an old note in the margin, erased quietly, politely, but completely. I walked back toward the main house that afternoon. Not to confront anyone. I just needed to see it up close, to understand what had already shifted. The gravel path had fresh ruts from a moving truck. The porch light was on, even though it was midday. The hummingbird feeder I'd kept on the window hook was gone. A new plant sat there instead, some glossy fern in a ceramic pot, like something from a magazine. As I stood beneath the window, I heard voices inside. Melissa's mother was saying something about repainting the hallway. Melissa replied with a tone that struck me. Cheerful, carefree. There was no grief in it, no crack in her voice, no pause between words, just smooth, practiced happiness. I left before they could see me. Not out of fear, out of something deeper, a recognition. Whatever part I had played in that house had ended. Not abruptly, not loudly. It had ended the way fog lifts, slowly, quietly, leaving only outline behind. That evening I sat outside the cabin and opened the notebook again. I turned back to the earliest page I had written about Melissa. It was dated nearly 11 years ago, the first time she and Russell brought her home for dinner. I had written one line: smiles too much when she's nervous, grips her wineglass too tight, watches every movement in the room. I remembered that night. I remembered how she had smiled at me like she already knew how I fit in her plan. Warm, but distant. Like someone trying to seem interested in a book they didn't intend to finish. Back then, I brushed it off. She was young. Maybe I was reading too much into it. I wanted to believe she would grow into the family, that she would make room for me the way I had made room for her. But that day, with the curtain gone and Russell's books boxed like clutter, I realized something important. She had never intended to grow with us. She came to replace, and I had let her, piece by piece. But not anymore. The next morning I pulled out the old lockbox I kept under the floorboards of the cabin. It was rusted around the hinges, and the key had to be jiggled a little before it turned. Inside were papers I hadn't looked at in years. Tax forms, birth certificates, and near the bottom the manila envelope Russell gave me the year he got married. I had nearly forgotten about it. At the time, he told me it was just for convenience. The bank, he said, wanted the deed split for refinancing. He and Melissa needed a better rate, something long-term. He asked me to sign the transfer of ownership for the main house and the surrounding land. Said it was just a formality, that nothing would really change. He looked tired that day. Not sad, just distant. Melissa sat in the passenger seat of their car engine still running. She didn't come in. I signed without reading. Now, a decade later, I held the same document in my hand, the edges curled from time and heat. It was all legal. I had no claim on the house. My name wasn't anywhere near it. But something else caught my eye. Folded behind the deed was a letter, not typed, written in Russell's handwriting. It was only a few lines. No date. I don't know how to say this without making things worse. Melissa wants space and I want peace. I hope this doesn't hurt you. I just need things to feel calm for once. Please trust me. It wasn't much, but I read it over and over. There was no apology, no explanation, just that word. Calm. Like he was choosing quiet over conflict. I folded the letter slowly, as if I were packing away something more than paper. I couldn't stop thinking about that afternoon in his car. The way he gripped the steering wheel, the way his voice didn't quite meet my eyes. Melissa didn't wave as they pulled out of the driveway. I realized then what I hadn't wanted to admit. Russell had been slipping away from me long before he died. It didn't happen all at once. It was gradual. He used to call every Sunday. Then it was every other week. Then birthdays only. The last time we had lunch, he spent more time checking his watch than asking about my health. I used to think he was just busy. Now I knew better. He had been shrinking himself inside that marriage. I don't think he disliked me. I think he was tired of being in between. Melissa had a way of taking up all the air in the room without raising her voice. She didn't need to argue. She simply decided what the center of the household was, and everything else had to orbit around her. Russell wanted to avoid tension, so he shifted, and shifted again, until there was no space left for me. And he let it happen. I stepped outside, holding the deed and the letter. The sky was clear for the first time all week. Cold, but still. The kind of morning where you can hear your own breath. I walked to the edge of the garden to the property marker near the cedar tree, the one Russell and I had hammered in ourselves the spring after his wedding. It was still solid, still visible in the grass. I wasn't going to fight for the house. That battle had already passed me by. But the land I stood on, the space he hadn't asked me to sign away, that was still mine. And now it would be where I drew the line. I spent most of that morning in silence. The kind of silence that fills a room like water rising in a well. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was weight. A quiet, pressing weight that told me I needed to act before I disappeared completely from my own story. I went back into the cabin and opened the metal file box I kept under the bench near the door. Years ago, I had organized every legal paper I ever signed into folders. One of them was labeled with a strip of blue tape land, East Lot. I pulled it out and laid it flat on the table. Inside were the documents from when I split the property. Russell had asked for the main parcel, and I had kept the eastern half for myself. It included the small cabin, the herb beds, and most important of all, the gravel driveway that stretched out to the main road. Back then, it was just a gesture of privacy, a way to keep a little space between the two homes. But now I saw it differently. That narrow stretch of land was the only access point to the house Melissa now claimed as hers. She had no idea the entire length of the driveway belonged to me. Not the county, not shared access, just me. I traced the surveyor lines with my finger. Every inch had been recorded, notarized, and filed with the town office. I remembered the day I walked it with Russell and the surveyor. He hadn't paid much attention. He was distracted. Melissa had been calling his phone every 10 minutes. I sat back and stared at the boundary lines. They were clear, sharp, undisputed. I folded the papers carefully and placed them in a clean envelope. Then I picked up the phone and called Grace Buckley. Grace had been a close friend when we both worked at the university. She had taught ethics in the law department before retiring a few years ago. We hadn't spoken much since Russell's wedding, but I remembered her steady voice, her patience, and her precision. She answered after 2 rings. I told her what happened. Not everything, just the facts. Melissa had changed the locks. Her parents were now living in the house. I had moved into the cabin, and I had legal ownership of the land leading up to their front door. There was a long pause. Then Grace asked me to meet her the next day. I ended the call and exhaled. For the first time in days, the air moved differently in my chest. Not lighter, just less stuck. That afternoon, I walked the property again, this time with a notepad. I took photos of the fence posts, the old cedar tree, the edges of the gravel drive. I noted the wear and tear, the exact turns and distances. Then I marked the corners with orange tape, tying it to the old stakes Russell and I had placed years ago. I wasn't doing it for drama. I wasn't trying to make a scene. I was making a record. By sunset, I had a folder of fresh documentation to hand Grace. Photos, notes, a copy of the original land deed. I labeled it simply, Access Rights. I locked the cabin door behind me that night with a new kind of certainty. Not anger, not revenge. A line had been crossed. Not just on paper, but in the quiet places where dignity lives. And now I had a line of my own, drawn in real soil, backed by law. And no one was going to step over it without me seeing them coming. The next morning, Tommy showed up in a grey pickup coated with mud from the back roads. He stepped out holding a thermos in one hand and a rolled-up measuring tape in the other. I hadn't seen him in nearly 6 months, not since Russell's memorial for his 20-year high school reunion. He hugged me without a word and looked around the cabin before speaking. He said he came because Grace called, said I needed help but didn't go into detail. I handed him the file labeled Access Rights. He read it, leaning on the tailgate of his truck, slow and quiet like someone opening a will. When he finished, he just nodded once. We got to work before the sun rose too high. The gravel path had always been rough, overgrown at the edges, with tufts of grass poking through where Russell never bothered to rake. Tommy brought a power trimmer and a fresh bag of concrete mix. We laid out bright orange flags to mark the border of my land, then cleared brush and reshaped the entryway. We reinforced the wooden posts along the driveway, just where it curved past the cedar tree. We didn't say much. Every now and then he'd ask me to hold the level or bring a bucket of water, and I did so without complaint. It felt good to move, to dig, to sweat. It gave my hands something to do besides tremble. By noon, we had cleared the entire stretch of road. The access lane was now clearly defined, separate and deliberate. Tommy suggested we add a gate, not the kind with buttons and motors, just a simple wooden arch with 2 swinging doors and a latch. He even brought the lumber. I asked him how he knew to bring it, and he smiled the way Russell used to, with one corner of his mouth lifted and the other hiding something. We had it standing by sunset. It was solid and clean, untreated pine with raw knots, no paint, no polish, just truth standing in the open. That night I boiled water over the camp stove and made a pot of tea. Tommy sat beside me on the cabin porch, drinking quietly, his boots still caked with dry soil. I asked him how things were with his mother, and he said they were fine. Then he looked out toward the house across the trees and said he remembered playing tag there with Russell as boys. They used to jump off the shed roof into the snowdrifts and thought it made them invincible. I didn't answer. We both knew things had changed long before Melissa came along, but neither of us had said it out loud. Before bed, I walked the new gate again. I ran my hand along the latch and pressed gently on the fresh wood. It didn't budge. For the first time in weeks, I felt something settle in my chest. Not peace exactly, but structure. A kind of quiet anchor. 3 days of work had given me more than 3 years of hoping ever did. And now that gate was the beginning of something I could stand behind. Literally and legally. No signs yet, no threats, no drama. But it was coming. And this time I wouldn't be caught by surprise. 2 days after we finished the gate, I woke up to the sound of laughter coming from the other side of the trees. I stepped out of the cabin, wrapped a shawl tight around my shoulders, and walked down the worn path toward the edge of my property. The house stood still in the morning light, trimmed and neat. A small table had been set up on the front porch. A camera on a tripod faced Melissa, who sat with her back straight, her hands resting loosely on her lap. She was filming something. Not a video call or a private message. The way she spoke slow and practiced told me it was a broadcast. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught pieces. She was talking about grief, about holding space for healing, about learning to create sanctuary after loss. She spoke as if she had invented pain. Behind her, the window curtains were drawn open. I saw the familiar outline of my old reading chair now draped in a cream-colored throw blanket. The shelves where my herb jars once lived were bare, filled instead with succulents and sculpted stones. I moved quietly back to the cabin and opened my laptop. Her live stream was everywhere: Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. The title read, "Healing from Within, Building Peace After Family Trauma." I watched her speak to thousands. She looked calm, polished, glowing under soft morning light. She thanked her followers for their support. She said the past month had been challenging, that after a family loss, she had chosen to rebuild her environment to reflect her emotional needs. She called it a shift toward intentional space. She never mentioned Russell by name. Not once. She never acknowledged where she lived or how she came to live there. She simply said she was turning pain into purpose. And people praised her for it. The comment feed streamed by. Words like strength and grace and inspiration. No one knew she had locked her husband's mother out of her home 3 days after the funeral. No one knew her parents now lived in the house that was once mine. No one knew I was just across the trees boiling water on a camp stove. That afternoon, Tommy came by with new bolts for the gate. I didn't tell him about the video. I didn't need to. He brought fresh paint and a wooden board, said we should make a sign for the entrance. I nodded. While he worked on carving the letters, I sat with Grace's notes spread across the table. She had drafted a formal notice of access rights. It was clear, concise, and fully enforceable. Melissa would no longer be able to use the driveway without my written consent, but I didn't send it. Not yet. I waited until the video had hit 30,000 views. Then I printed a still image of the live stream. One frame where Melissa sat, smiling, framed by the doorway of the house I once opened every morning. I tucked it inside the access folder. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. Melissa was crafting a version of the story that suited her. I wasn't going to interrupt it. I was going to counter it. Quietly. Precisely. The next morning, I placed the carved sign at the gate with Tommy. It read private access, no entry without authorization. Then I walked the line again, every inch of my boundary, not out of fear, out of awareness. Melissa wanted the world to think she was the center of healing, but I had something she couldn't live stream. The truth, backed by the ground beneath my feet, and the gate she would soon have to explain. The envelope was thick and sealed with precision. Grace had it sent overnight, along with an official cover letter from her firm. The notice wasn't threatening, it was just clear. Melissa no longer had legal right to use the driveway without entering into a formal access agreement. She could respond within 10 business days. After that, the gate would remain locked indefinitely, and any attempt to force access would be grounds for legal action. I didn't deliver it myself. Grace had it couriered. That was her way. Clean, neutral, no emotion where the law could do the talking. It arrived on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Melissa was live again. This time the background was different. She sat indoors, angled just enough to avoid showing the front window. Her voice was slower, a little tighter. She spoke about unexpected obstacles, about how life sometimes throws barriers in our path, and how those barriers are really mirrors meant to show us where we still carry resentment. Her mother sat just outside of frame folding laundry. Her father walked through the kitchen behind her holding a toolbox. She never mentioned the letter. She never spoke my name. But that night I received a text. It was short, from a number I didn't recognize at first. Then I realized it was Melissa. "You made your point. Let's be reasonable. No greeting, no signature, just that." I didn't answer. The next day, I walked down to the gate. It was intact. The sign still clean, the latch still firm. I stood there for a long moment, staring down the empty gravel that led to the house I once called home. And I waited. An hour later, a black SUV pulled up and parked just outside the gate. Melissa stepped out wearing a soft grey sweater and sunglasses. She didn't try to open the gate. She just stood there and looked at me. When I didn't move, she raised a hand, a small wave. Then she walked back to the car and left. That evening, Tommy came by with another delivery from Grace. Inside was a USB drive. He handed it to me and said I should probably watch it in full before deciding what to do next. I plugged it into the old laptop and opened the only file it contained. It was a recording, a voicemail, from Melissa. It had been forwarded from Russell's old cell number. The recording had been saved through the service provider, archived before the number was disconnected after his death. I sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of the moment already sinking into my chest before I even pressed play. Her voice came through clear, measured, cold. She said it the day after the funeral. "I think we should make the transition sooner. It's too crowded with her energy here. I'll handle the locks. I need this space clean before I can think clearly. The sooner she understands, the easier it'll be for everyone." I didn't move for a full minute after it ended. Then I copied the file to a second drive and placed it in the envelope labeled Access Rights. No drama, no outrage, just a small piece of clarity to sit beside the deed, the survey, and the photo of the live stream. Melissa wanted to teach the world about healing, but I had just heard what she said when no one was watching, and now so would others, when the time was right. The next morning, I painted the final stroke across the wooden sign and hung it on the new gate. The wood was dry now, sealed after days of wind and sun. The letters were carved deep, and I traced them one last time with the tip of my finger before I stepped back. This gate leads to nowhere for those who shut every other door. It wasn't meant to be poetic. It was meant to be plain. Meant to remind Melissa and anyone watching that silence had a shape. And it stood right here between her version of healing and the truth I lived in. Later that day, I watched from the cabin window as a delivery van stopped just outside the property. A young man in uniform stepped out, holding 2 packages. He walked toward the gate, looked confused for a moment, then turned back and left them by the mailbox at the road. The gate remained closed. The message was clear. By late afternoon, I heard the sound of voices near the fence. Melissa and her father stood at the edge of their porch, staring across the clearing toward the garden beds near the cabin, the same ones she once called cluttered. Her mother came out holding a phone, took a few photos, then disappeared inside. No one approached the gate. 2 days passed. Then the first sign of real unraveling came. A truck from a local home service company backed into the driveway and then stopped short. The driver stepped out, looked around, and then left without delivering anything. No one came to speak with me. No one rang the bell or called. But by evening, Melissa posted a new update online. Her followers were informed that due to unforeseen property disputes, she would be temporarily relocating the Mindfulness Studio project to another location. She asked for patience. She spoke of boundaries, of letting go, of detaching from negativity. The house behind her, once the backdrop for her message of peace, looked different now. The windows were closed, the porch furniture gone. The flag that once hung from the side beam had been removed. I stood on my porch as the sun dropped behind the trees and watched the soft blue light of her living room flicker on, then off again. Russell's home was growing quieter by the day. By the weekend, Melissa stopped broadcasting. The comments on her videos turned quieter too. Some asked if she was okay. Others speculated about what had happened. A few even said they missed the garden shots. I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I turned my focus to what I still had. I spent my mornings tending the herb beds, rebuilding the raised boxes that had collapsed over the last few years. I planted rows of lavender sage and lemon balm. I cleared the path behind the cedar tree and added a bench where the soil was soft and shaded. I started writing again, this time in a different notebook. One without lists. One that belonged to the days ahead. Tommy came by and dropped off a new wheelbarrow. No words, just a nod and a quiet gesture. He walked the line of the fence one more time and checked the gate before he left. That night, as the wind picked up and the trees rustled against the edge of the clearing, I sat alone with a cup of tea and listened. Not for voices, not for footsteps. I listened for what wasn't there. No knocking, no calling, just stillness. The kind of stillness that says a chapter is closing and something else is ready to begin. It started with a voicemail I nearly deleted. The voice on the message introduced herself as Carrie from a regional radio station. She said they had heard about my land project through someone in the community, something about a garden for older women who had been displaced. She said it quietly, like she wasn't sure if it was true or rumor. I played the message twice. Then I sat down and looked around the cabin. The garden beds were no longer overgrown. The fence line was clean. The path to the gate was solid. I had built something, whether I meant to or not. It had structure. And now someone had noticed. I called her back the next morning. We talked for 20 minutes. I told her about the herbs, the land, the way things had changed after Russell's passing. I didn't mention names. I didn't talk about Melissa or the gate or the voice recording. I spoke only about the way life sometimes folds in on itself and you are left holding a corner, unsure of how to open it again. Carrie asked if I would be willing to come on the show. She said it didn't have to be live. We could pre-record. She just thought listeners might connect with the idea that older women still had stories worth telling, that even after loss, there was room to begin again. 2 days later, I drove into town. Grace met me outside the station. She wore a navy coat and carried a thermos of tea. She didn't say much, just patted my hand before I walked into the building. The room was small and warm. A single microphone. A glass window separating us from the sound tech who gave me a thumbs up. Carrie smiled and said whenever I was ready. I told the story straight, not dramatic, not broken, just as it happened. I told them how I had lived on this land for over 30 years, how I raised a son, how I shared that land with him, and how when he was gone, the parts that mattered were nearly erased. I told them about the garden, the fence, the act of rebuilding with intention instead of anger. Carrie asked what I would call the space if I had to give it a name. I said it was still just home. But maybe for someone else one day, it could be a place where dignity returned quietly. That line ended up as the closing quote of the episode. By the end of the week, people started showing up. Not crowds, just a few women. Older, alone. Some brought cuttings from their own gardens. Others came with books, tools, questions. They didn't speak about their losses. They just stood with me in the soil, hands dirty, shoulders relaxed. Tommy built a second bench near the back tree line. Grace drafted a short agreement for community use. I signed it without hesitation. The space grew not in size, but in soul. Across the trees, Melissa's house remained still. No cars in the driveway, no porch lights. She had taken her broadcast elsewhere. Her online channels went quiet. Her face disappeared from the local feed. I heard she moved back in with her parents in the city. I didn't confirm it. I didn't need to. I had no desire to follow her story. Mine had finally taken root, and every day in the light of a new morning I chose to tend it. Carefully, quietly, without apology. The bench under the oak tree became the place where women sat without needing to speak. Most came alone. Some drove hours just to see the garden as if the quiet here had reached them through the static of their own lives. I never asked why they came. I only made sure the kettle stayed warm and the path was clear. One afternoon, a woman named Harriet brought a bag of peppermint cuttings. She said her husband used to grow them before the stroke changed everything. She didn't say more. I didn't ask her to. We planted the cuttings near the lemon balm, side by side, letting the scents mingle in the late spring air. That evening I took out the old notebook, not the green one where I kept lists, the new one, the one I had started after the gate was built. I wrote about the day Russell was born, not because I needed to remember, I never forgot, but because it felt right to write it down with a steadier hand. Not from grief, not from guilt, just from a place of having lived through all of it. I wrote about how he came early, how the nurse said he was quiet even then, how his eyes stayed locked on mine for the full hour. They cleaned him, wrapped him, placed him in my arms. I didn't write about Melissa, not in that entry. I wrote about how Russell used to run down the back hill barefoot in the summer, how he hated socks, how he once tied feathers to his arms and leapt off the porch stairs, convinced he could fly. The wind moved through the trees as I wrote. Not hard, just enough to lift the edge of the page. Later that week I received a letter, not email, not typed, a real envelope with a real stamp. It was from Russell's college roommate, Clay. He had listened to the radio interview and wanted to say he remembered me. Said he used to come by the house for dinner when they were students. He said Russell once told him he felt safe here, like the walls understood how to hold silence without pressing on it. I sat with that sentence for a long time. The walls understood how to hold silence. There are things a mother wants to believe, that her child was happy, that her home was a sanctuary, that even when the years grow cold and people drift, some part of what she gave still lives in someone else's memory. That evening I walked the garden with a basket over my arm and collected thyme and mint for drying. I moved slow. Not from pain, but because I wanted to stay in it. The air, the rhythm, the sound of leaves brushing past each other like quiet conversations. The bench under the oak had 2 people on it now. Women I had met only last week, both watching the sky without needing words. I waved, then returned to the cabin. As I closed the door behind me, I looked once more toward the old driveway. The gate stood firm. The sign still hung straight. But the life behind it had changed. Not in loud declarations, not in revenge, just in truth. Finally having room to breathe. Spring turned to early summer, and the garden took on a rhythm of its own. The women kept coming. Some stayed an hour, some stayed the whole afternoon. They watered plants, trimmed herbs, sat in silence, or wandered between the cedar and the lemon balm with their hands in their pockets and their hearts wide open. No one asked for permission. They simply arrived and knew. The land didn't need explanation. It offered something few places could, a kind of dignity that didn't beg to be seen. I no longer checked the window for Melissa's car. I no longer wondered if she would return. The gate remained, but it wasn't a wall. It was a marker, a line of truth that made space for everything after it. Grace visited on a Thursday, with a thin folder in her hand. Inside was the final draft of the deed transfer. I had decided to donate the land, this portion of it, to a non-profit that supported housing and skill building for older women. It was a small organization, quiet like me, but it had reach, and more important, it had heart. The cabin would remain mine, but the garden, the path, the benches, even the shaded corner under the oak, all of it would live beyond me now. I signed the papers with steady hands. Later, I sat by the edge of the herbs and watched 2 girls in their 60s plant lavender near the walkway. One wore a sun hat too big for her head. The other had gardening gloves with flowers stitched on the wrists. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The sound of their shovels in the dirt was enough. When the light shifted and the air turned gold, I stood and walked back to the cabin. I lit a candle, brewed tea, and opened my notebook to a blank page. I didn't write anything, not because I had nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered was already planted, right outside the window, and growing. If this story found you at the right moment, maybe you understand what it means to lose your place, then build something stronger with your own hands. If you've ever been quietly erased from a space you once called home, just know this dignity doesn't shout. It stands. It plants. It grows. If you'd like to hear more stories like this or share your own quiet return, I'd love to know. Your story matters too. Thank you for listening.